The Boys from New Jersey by Robert Rudolph. Chapter 1. It was a cool afternoon in late summer of 1985 when Vincent Grady O'Malley drove his car into the tree-shrouded driveway leading to the secluded Morris County home of U.S. Attorney Thomas W. Grealish. O'Malley had followed the directions he had been given, leading him into a winding country road on the outskirts of Morristown, the historic suburban community where General George Washington set up his military command during the winter of 1779. Tom Grealish's home was located on a cul-de-sac off a side road just west of Jockey Hollow, a vast tract of woodlands and field where Washington's army spent the winter in log cabins and tents, while their commander-in-chief enjoyed the hospitality of a wealthy hostess who owned a mansion adjacent to the sprawling acreage. 200 years later, the area still retained its country charm. It remains staid, comfortable, and staunchly Republican, and Grealish found the area just as much to his liking as did Washington. The Grealish house was a two-story white clapboard colonial, with a gray brick front and black shutters, situated on a 2-acre plot at the end of his street. The trees and shrubs that lined the driveway rustled gently in the easy breeze as O'Malley slammed shut the door of his car and approached the house. Summer seemed to have ended early. It was almost as if it were autumn. It was an important day for O'Malley. He had come to see Grealish to discuss a case that had consumed his professional life for the past several years. He was carrying a final draft of an indictment that he planned to present to the federal grand jury that week. It encompassed the entire leadership of the Lucchese crime family in New Jersey. The indictment was historic in scope. It spelled out charges against more than 24 persons accused of participating in a racketeering conspiracy that had spanned more than a decade and that involved a multitude of criminal offenses ranging from gambling and loan sharking to extortion, fraud, and drug dealing. O'Malley, a former pro basketball player with the Atlanta Hawks, who had a reputation for aggressiveness, had hung up his sneakers after a single season to pursue a career in law enforcement. He had carried his aggressiveness with him. The indictment he had prepared was to be a major, debilitating blow to the mob, but O'Malley needed one thing to proceed: Grealish's stamp of approval. On this Sunday morning, O'Malley passed the flower garden outside the rear of Grealish's house, where a collection of perennials provided a colorful backdrop for an old-fashioned sundial that served as the centerpiece of the garden. The sundial registered nearly high noon. As U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, Tom Grealish was the top federal law enforcement officer in the state, and as such, no indictment could be prosecuted without his signature. Although O'Malley was technically assigned to the U.S. Organized Crime Strike Force, which was at the time a separate U.S. Justice Department unit directed out of Washington, previous U.S. attorneys had exerted their political muscle and influence and had kept the New Jersey outpost of the agency under the aegis of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Thus, every indictment prepared by the strike force had to be approved and signed by the U.S. Attorney. Grealish did not know O'Malley well. The two had met at a Christmas party for federal prosecutors several years earlier, when a mutual acquaintance, spotting the two 6'5" men towering over the crowd, took it upon himself to introduce them, apparently believing that because of their height, they would have a lot in common. As it turned out, they didn't. In the corridors of the federal building in Newark, the two passed one another occasionally and would nod or exchange a brief pleasantry, but they were far from friends. And this Sunday, Grealish was not relishing the thought of his visit. Grealish knew O'Malley to be an intense man with a short fuse and a hot temper. The summer was just cooling down. He didn't need it to heat up again. Grealish, lanky, with a shock of straight dark hair, had the appearance of a towering farm boy. His professional demeanor was like that of a country lawyer, with an aw shucks courtroom style straight out of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The grandson of an Italian butcher, Grealish had been raised in the bucolic Hunterdon County community of Califon and had followed a winding and sometimes bumpy road to his present position. A college dropout, he had worked as a laborer in a local brewery before finally deciding to return to school, where he eventually settled on a career in law. While working his way through Seton Hall Law School, Grealish so impressed a federal appeals court judge during the school's annual moot court competition that he was recommended for a job as the first law clerk for Frederick B. Lacey, a crime-busting federal prosecutor who had just been appointed a federal judge. Later, he was placed as an assistant prosecutor under Lacey's successor, Herbert J. Stern, an equally aggressive headline-making crime fighter. As the following anecdote attests, Grealish did not exactly fit the mold of a typical prosecutor. One day, early in his law enforcement career, he wandered into a courtroom during the prosecution of a mob trial. A government informant, his face swathed in bandages to conceal his appearance, sat on the witness stand testifying against a notorious New York mafia figure. When Grealish entered the room, the witness hesitated, then motioned to the judge. A moment later, the judge granted an adjournment. Something was clearly wrong. The something was Grealish. Wearing a dark shirt, jacket, and tie, Grealish hardly resembled a government lawyer. The witness had taken one look at him, seated in the rear of the courtroom, and had immediately panicked. The informant had to be taken aside and convinced that Grealish was actually a government prosecutor, one of the good guys, and not the mob hitman he'd been mistaken for. When he was an aide to Stern, however, few mistook Grealish for anything but what he was, a top-drawer prosecutor. Grealish quickly found himself immersed in a host of sensational corruption cases, including the prosecution of Cornelius Gallagher, one of New Jersey's most influential members of Congress. And eventually, after a brief stint in private practice, Grealish returned to the public sector, where he was trapped in 1983 to join the U.S. Attorney's Office. O'Malley, on the other hand, had followed a much different route. As the second oldest son of an old-line Irish family from Boston, O'Malley had grown up in comparative wealth in the upper-middle-class Boston suburb of Newton. His father, who had a law degree and an MBA from Harvard, was a banker, and his grandfather had been an editor of the Old Boston Herald. Ever since high school, O'Malley knew he wanted to be a trial lawyer. His height, however, offered an alternative. O'Malley had made his mark in college as a captain of the Manhattan College basketball team and had acquired a reputation as a hustler on the court, grabbing 35 rebounds in his sophomore year. He had been overlooked in college drafts after having missed several games in his senior year, and as a result wound up being drafted 20th and last, and then only on the recommendation of his coach to a longtime friend, Richie Guerin, who was then coach of the Atlanta Hawks. It was not a good career move. After a single lackluster season, he was on the court a total of 113 minutes and averaged 2.1 points per game. O'Malley decided that his future lay in another court, and he enrolled in Boston College Law School. Before joining the Justice Department, he worked in the New York District Attorney's Office in the Bronx, getting his feet wet in the courtroom by prosecuting a host of major multi-offender street crime cases, developing and honing his courtroom expertise and learning about life on the seamier side of the tracks. When he crossed the Hudson River to join the staff of the U.S. Strike Force in New Jersey in 1977, O'Malley began building a reputation as a no-nonsense prosecutor who could take even a marginal case and bulldoze his way to victory. In fact, he never lost. Prosecutors shouldn't lose cases, O'Malley declared during a discussion of his philosophy towards his work. Cases, when they're indicted, are indicted because the evidence is there. And on that summer day in 1985, that was what he had come to convince Grealish of. that the evidence against the bosses and followers of a powerful organized crime family was there, and that he should be given the final authorization to proceed with the prosecution that would destroy them and their organization. For O'Malley, it was the capstone to a series of investigations that had begun nearly a decade before. It was 1979, and he had been supervising an investigation involving a firm that was supposed to have fireproofed a vocational education school in Hudson County, New Jersey. Instead, the company just threw a coat of paint over the walls and claimed the job was done. During the investigation, agents began to encounter an individual named Michael Tassetta. He was using an office at the fireproofing company and could be seen coming and going, hosting meetings in a back room. As a result of the federal investigation, the company went bankrupt. Tassetta moved on, and the government followed. The sons of a known bookmaker, Michael Tassetta and his brother Martin, have been tagged by the New Jersey State Police with the nickname of the Bowling Balls. Both stocky, although by the time of the trial Martin had slimmed down and looked more like a Hollywood leading man, they were known for bullying their way through areas of Essex and Morris counties, terrorizing local business owners, particularly those who had a penchant for gambling and gambling badly. Whenever these businessmen fell into debt, authorities claimed they found that they had new friends, the Tassettas and his boys. In one instance, Tassetta was portrayed as being a sort of unofficial host of a prominent Morris County eatery, drinking, eating, and doing business from its tables during the day, while an aide would dip freely into the cash register for spending money, claiming the money was owed to him by the owner as interest on his gambling debts. The situation became so outlandish, authorities reported, that the restaurant owner, whose credit was drying up quickly, had friends take out loans under their own names and give the money to him to appease the Tassettas. By May of 1982, Tassetta and his associates, who by now had become familiar faces to the men watching him, had moved to another location, the Hole in the Wall, a storefront luncheonette in Down Neck section of Newark, nestled between warehouses and factories in a seedy industrial area of the state's largest city. After watching a collection of Cadillacs and Mercedes-Benz parading to the luncheonette at all hours, a reporter from the New York Times had written that when the patrons of the luncheonette wanted to eat, they ordered out. O'Malley and the FBI were able to obtain a warrant from a federal judge authorizing the installation of wiretaps and bugs. Those taps and bugs produced hundreds of hours of recordings in which the suspects were overheard discussing everything from loan sharking debts to concerns over their wives attending a neighborhood demonstration of frilly nightwear, a sort of Tupperware party for negligees. The information gathered on these tapes eventually served as the basis for the charges contained in O'Malley's proposed indictment. The strike force prosecutor had approached Grealish in his office with the paperwork on the case. He had drafted an indictment formalizing the charges and was prepared to present it to the grand jury. It was ready, O'Malley said, for Grealish's signature. A grand jury is a group of between 16 to 23 citizens who have received a special jury service notice, in most cases not a particularly welcome one. Instead of sitting on a trial, they are asked to come back week after week for months. In New Jersey, the usual term of service is 18 months, but in some instances it can be as long as 3 years. Technically, the grand jury is the arbiter of probable cause, the organ of the court that decides whether someone's name will show up in the following day's newspaper as charged with. In reality, however, many legal experts maintain they are little more than rubber stamps that do what the prosecutors want. One former top state law enforcement official admitted that at one time during his tenure, the state of New Jersey utilized 3 types of grand juries. One was used for politically sensitive cases that everyone in authority would like to see just go away, and that eventually indicted no one. The second was just the opposite. It indicted everyone the prosecutor wanted it to, evidence or not. The third did just what it was supposed to do. It evaluated the evidence and decided for itself. In federal cases in New Jersey, grand juries and prosecutors tend to see eye to eye. There have been relatively few cases where a grand jury has refused to indict if the prosecutor recommended it. Generally, this is because the cases are fairly good ones, but there is always the chance that something might slip by. Despite O'Malley's insistence, Grealish was not prepared to act as quickly as the strike force prosecutor might have liked. He wanted to review O'Malley's case for himself before he signed off. He wanted to be certain that this was a case that should be brought, and just as important, that it was a case that the government was going to win. O'Malley, who had earned a reputation for brassness among his colleagues, was not a man who took lightly what he perceived to be criticism. He was combative and aggressive, even with his supervisors. In arguments, he would get loud, red in the face, and bluster his way through, pointing his finger at the target of his ire. It was a combat technique he would use against virtually anyone with whom he came into verbal conflict, including the U.S. Attorney Grealish. Grealish, on his part, wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with O'Malley. He also didn't want the meeting to turn into an all-day event. He was cordial when O'Malley arrived and ushered him into the back porch. It was clear from the outset that O'Malley was not pleased with the situation. He had spent years on this case. He knew it inside and out. It was, as far as he was concerned, a clear-cut winner. Grealish offered O'Malley a seat at a redwood table located in the center of the screened-in porch. The house was bustling with noise and family activity, and this spot offered the best opportunity for privacy. The two men were both dressed casually. Grealish was wearing jeans, topsiders, and no socks. O'Malley, sneakers, and a warm-up suit. As they spoke, Grealish was candid in expressing his position. He was not going to put his signature to anything that he wasn't convinced deserved to be brought. Furthermore, what O'Malley was proposing was as historical as it was ambitious. Never before had an entire organized crime family been indicted. This thing had to be right. Grealish wanted to make sure the case was airtight. "And I may want to do more than just review the indictment," Grealish told O'Malley. "I may want you to sit down and delineate for me all of the proofs in this case." O'Malley flushed. "This is my case," he shot back. "I'm a professional. You should be able to take my word for this." Grealish was not cowed. He spoke slowly, but with increased force and volume. "I am the United States Attorney," he said. "I am the chief law enforcement officer in this district. I've got a responsibility to the people of the state. I've got to be satisfied that this indictment ought to be brought." O'Malley got to his feet and glared down at Grealish. Grealish pushed himself away from the table and got to his feet and stared eyeball to eyeball at O'Malley. Neither made a move until O'Malley spoke. "I know this case," O'Malley shouted. "I know these people. I've lived with it. The Bureau has spent years on it." "I don't give a damn how long anybody has worked on it," Grealish shouted back. "It doesn't make a difference." Grealish was more than aware of the responsibility he had. In the midst of the argument, he felt both frustration and worry. If he didn't sign the piece of paper, the prosecution, however historic it might be, just wasn't going to happen. And whatever O'Malley had to say, however angry or incensed he might be, and no matter how much he blustered and carried on, the ball was totally in Grealish's court. And the more that O'Malley argued, the more insistent Grealish became that he had to be satisfied that everything was in order. O'Malley had to accept that no assistant prosecutor could unilaterally decide whether an indictment, particularly one as important as this one, should be brought. No assistant could do that, and before this, no one had ever tried. "Look," said Grealish, lowering his voice, "we're on the same team. We share the same goals and ambitions. We want the same thing. We want this thing to be right." O'Malley tried to convince Grealish to sign the document then and there. O'Malley had been given his head by the strike force and had concentrated his energies into putting the case together. Now someone was questioning his judgment. Grealish, however, refused to waver. He wanted more time. He knew the stakes. If a case this big were to be lost, the results would be devastating. Not only would it be an embarrassment to the law enforcement, but it would wind up enhancing the reputations of the men they had set out to convict. It would make the mob even stronger than before. Grealish stayed up late that night. He read and reread the indictment, and the next morning he read it again. The following week, he met with O'Malley again. The meeting lasted into the night. The two men started over, rehashing the facts of the case and the proofs that substantiated the charges. O'Malley explained and explained until finally Grealish was satisfied. The case appeared to be solid. The evidence was all there. Even the Justice Department, which pre-screens all racketeering indictments, had agreed and had approved it for prosecution. Grealish was the last obstacle. Leaning over his desk, Grealish finally did what O'Malley had wanted. He took his pen and signed off. And on August 19, 1985, a federal grand jury in Newark, New Jersey, returned the indictment, which was sealed by the federal court and placed in a vault in the federal courthouse in Newark. 2 days later, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office issued dual press releases. The FBI in New Jersey today announced the arrest of 19 individuals in New Jersey and Florida, based on a federal indictment returned in Newark, New Jersey, charging them with racketeering violations committed in 1976 and July 1985. Teams of FBI agents in New Jersey, Florida, and New York made the arrests shortly after dawn this morning. The charges against these individuals include violations of the Rico statute and their participation in organized criminal group which reaped millions of dollars in profits from trafficking in cocaine and marijuana, loan sharking, gambling, counterfeit credit cards, and infiltration of legitimate businesses. As the arrests were being carried out, Tom Grealish stood at the window of his fifth-floor command center in the federal office building in Newark. A panoramic sprawl of the city spread out before him. In a few moments, he would make his announcement to the public. His staff had summoned representatives from the press and television stations in the New Jersey, New York area, and cameras and reporters were already waiting in the conference room for the press conference to begin. Grealish had been briefed on the operation by his aides. He checked his watch and slipped on his suit jacket. He was ready. Downstairs, Grealish wove his way through the packed audience of television cameras and print reporters and stepped up to the dais. He took his place behind a podium, flanked by representatives of a host of federal and state law enforcement agencies. O'Malley was among them. Grealish cleared his throat and made his proclamation. The arrests carried out this morning, he said, had brought a dramatic halt to the operation of one of the 5 families of organized crime here in New Jersey. It was, Grealish declared forcefully, the most comprehensive set of charges ever to be brought against organized crime figures in New Jersey. As the cameras whirred, he described how FBI agents had meticulously gathered evidence that had been pieced together from a multitude of wiretaps and electronic bugs planted in the mob's own headquarters, a tiny luncheonette in Newark's heavily industrialized Down Neck section. He spoke of mob sit-downs, threats of victims whose heads were going to be busted, of takeovers of legitimate businesses, and of loan sharking operations that demanded payment of interest rates in excess of 156% a year. He then turned over the podium to one of the other law enforcement officials. Robert Wright, the assistant special agent in charge of the FBI for New Jersey at the time, told the audience that the New Jersey faction of the Lucchese crime family, headed by Asatoro and Tessetta, had risen to power during the last decade following the untimely deaths of members of another crime family, the Bruno Organization of Philadelphia, whose leadership was decimated as a result of a bloody battle for control of the crime empire. Those deaths, Wright sternly averred, created a vacuum that was filled by Asatoro and Taseda's organization. They filled the vacuum very aggressively, Wright declared, as he paused and leaned into the microphone on the podium for dramatic effect, and I think we can say that we have created another vacuum.